Welcome to Radicalize Me. If you like what we do here, please help us out with a Patreon subscription or a one-time donation at Buy Me a Coffee. Or you can like, comment, and subscribe here for free. Vulcans. Can't live with them? Vulcans have been a part of Star Trek since the very beginning, with Spock being the only character to appear in the rejected original pilot, The Cage, and remain a lead character for the second pilot and the rest of the series. Later on, the show introduced Spock's parents. While his mother Amanda is human, his father Sarek is an ambassador from the planet Vulcan and a representative on the Federation Council. Sarek and Amanda make appearances on the original series, the animated series, Next Generation, Discovery, and the Kelvin movies. Now, a lot of the Vulcan lore comes from TOS. Right away, we learn that Spock doesn't express emotion in the way his mostly human crewmates do. In Season 1, Episode 1, The Man Trap, Spock is temporarily in command of the Enterprise while Kirk, McCoy, and a doomed third crewman are on an away mission. Spock remains stoic when he finds out one of them has died, but not which one. And Uhura is in disbelief at his apparent lack of concern.
Transporter room to bridge. Landing party returning. They report one death.
Bridge acknowledging.
I don't believe it. Somebody is dead and you just sit there. It could be Captain Kirk. He's the closest thing you have to a friend.
It's important to note that it's a misconception to say Vulcans don't have emotions. They are just trained not to express them or give in to them. We'll get more into that later on, but Spock actually implies this in the clip, saying that expressing concern wouldn't help the situation or bring back the dead crew member.
Lieutenant, my demonstration of concern will not change what has happened. The transporter room is very well manned, and they will call me if they need my assistance.
This idea is essential to Vulcan belief. Deciding that a particular expression of emotion is illogical is quite different from claiming not to have emotions at all. In Season 2, Episode 1, Amok Time, Spock experiences the Pon Farr, a Vulcan state of sex mania that we'll also get into later. But during the episode, an archaic Vulcan ritual lands him and Captain Kirk in a battle to the death. Spock wins and fears that he killed Kirk, only for Kirk to appear alive and well back on the Enterprise. This leads to an uncharacteristic outpouring of emotion from Spock, smiling and excitedly addressing the captain by his first name.
Captain! Jim!
When he realizes McCoy and Nurse Chapel saw this, Spock quickly resumes his usual stoic demeanor.
I'm pleased to see you, Captain. You seem uninjured.
Another example of Vulcan emotion comes from Spock's father Sarek in Star Trek 2009, the first movie of the Kelvin trilogy. Early in the film, Spock asks why Sarek married a human, his mother Amanda, which was an unusual choice for a Vulcan. Sarek's first answer is that, as an ambassador to Earth, it was logical to have a human wife. Later, and this is a huge spoiler if you haven't seen it, when Amanda dies in the destruction of the Vulcan homeworld, Sarek tells Spock that he married her because he loved her.
You asked me once why I married your mother. I married her because I loved her.
In the same movie, Kirk and Spock start out with reversed roles. Spock is the captain while Kirk is the first officer. At one point, Kirk needs to gain control of the ship. So he sets out to prove Spock is emotionally compromised by witnessing the destruction of Vulcan and death of his mom. He claims that because Spock is not displaying signs of grief outwardly, he must not care about his mom. Enough of this prodding causes Spock to have an emotional outburst and physically attack Kirk. Mission accomplished.
You never loved her!
Doctor, I am no longer fit for duty.
These Vulcan displays of emotion made me wonder, do Vulcans exaggerate their dedication to logic and the serenity it supposedly brings them? Are they an enlightened society that has overcome fealty to their emotions? Or are they a repressed society that refuses to reconcile their inner demons and violent past? This is a traumatized society with a lot of problems they've seemingly moved past, but maybe not dealt with. And I will say, because I will be criticizing Vulcans a lot here, but I actually think they're pretty cool a lot of the time. Spock, Tuvok, and T'Pol are among the best main cast characters in all of Trek. And overall, their culture is an interesting contrast to the highly expressive Klingons and the more mixed behavior of humans. The Pon farr, which we mentioned earlier, is perhaps the most obvious reason to think the Vulcans are not as chill as they claim. So it's a biological mating process Vulcan males go through every 7 years. And it makes them go completely fucking nuts.
You are my mate, not his.
What are you doing?
They revert to a primal state and become agitated and even violent. No one can communicate or reason with them. And basically they must fuck immediately or they'll die. So from the jump, this seems a little off. Now, to be fair, even in old canon, it's established that Vulcans can and do have sex outside of Pon farr, and modern canon seems to hold true to the idea that Vulcans can break the cycle. In the first episode of Strange New Worlds, we see Spock and his fiancée T'Pring, a resurrected storyline from TOS, getting the Vulcan version of hot and bothered at this restaurant before going back to their residence to get it on. Spock seems very much in control of his faculties here, and is definitely not Pon farring.
Query.
Response.
Vulcans are so formal.
Aren't we, though?
It's important to note that Spock and T'Pring didn't get to have sex that night because Pike called and interrupted. So this might set us up for Spock to have a Pon farr incident later in the Enterprise mission, which also happened in TOS, which takes place about 10 years later. The following quote from TOS writer D.C. Fontana clears up some of the misconceptions about the Pon farr. Vulcans mate normally anytime they want to. However, every 7 years you do the ritual, the ceremony, the whole thing, the biological urge. You must. But any other time is any other emotion. Humanoid emotion, when you're in love, when you want to. You know when the urge is there, you do it. The every 7 years business was taken too literally by too many people who don't stop and understand. We didn't mean it only every 7 years. I mean, every 7 years would be a little bad, and it would not explain the Vulcans of many different ages, which are not 7 years apart. DC Fontana seems a little bristled about that. So we can probably assume that Vulcans often suppress their sexual urges, much like their other emotions, but much like humans, they do it when they feel like it. As far as on-screen portrayals of the Pon farr go, no one did it better than Tuvok and the Doctor in the Voyager episode Tinker, Tenor, Doctor, Spy.
He's been seized by the Pon farr. We won't be able to reason with him.
Tuvok, I understand. You are a Vulcan man. You have just gone without for 7 years about. It's all so very illogical.
According to Trek lore, Vulcans were once an incredibly violent, primitive species. Trek also portrays human society as having overcome its own violent impulses that we in the real world are still struggling with in the present day. But the Vulcans were even worse. Just full-on orcs with no regard for life. Some centuries ago, they began to examine themselves, or I guess examine themselves less when it came to sex, and realized they had to make a change or face possible extinction. This eventually led to their devotion to logic, reason, and scientific discovery. Also to their restraint. But I have to wonder if they overcorrected. This reminds me of how a lot of born-again Christians will say their conversion changed their life because they had been drug-addicted alcoholics who engaged in all sorts of risky behavior at great cost to themselves and their families. George W. Bush and Glenn Beck are two famous examples that come to mind. I certainly don't think it's a bad thing when people are able to get sober and create a healthier life for themselves. But going too far in the other direction can also be risky. Bush quit drinking, but also invaded Iraq. We can see an example of this type of overcorrection if we look at the history of human-Vulcan relations in the Star Trek universe. In First Contact, we learn that Vulcans revealed themselves to humans on Earth in 2063 when Zephram Cochrane achieved warp travel. I am such a loser. Fleet's lack of progress under Vulcan supervision.
We've been deferring to their judgment for 100 years.
John.
How much longer?
Until you've proven you're ready.
By officer. So we're in 2151 by this point, almost 90 years after Vulcans made first contact. Was it logical to wait this long? I'm sure it was logical to proceed with caution. When they found humanity, we were in the aftermath of World War III and climate catastrophe. But the lore of Star Trek has always been that humanity finally figures its shit out at that point. By the early 22nd century, which we see early on in Enterprise, it seems like humans have completely rebuilt society from the wasteland we saw in First Contact. Are the Vulcans being reasonable? Even if they were right to not let humans off the leash just yet, it took 30 years to let us go on a supervised Warp 5 mission? Let us give it a fucking test drive at least. Or send out a dog like the Russians did with Sputnik. Porthos should have been the first Warp 5 traveler. Like Archer pointed out, humans don't have the luxury of a 200-year lifespan like Vulcans do, which meant his father never got to see his work come to fruition. The way they delayed Earth from participating in space exploration for so long wasn't very logical. It made sense for them to observe humans until they saw evidence that we had overcome our violent past, but after we had, it seemed more like the Vulcans were being patriarchal and overly paternalistic about keeping humans on the ground. It would be like if the US worked incredibly hard to prevent smaller nations from developing out of fear of losing influence and power. Good thing that's never happened. And again, I just don't believe everything is perfect on Vulcan. Even if you can argue their society was more peaceful than ours, even by the 22nd century, I've seen you pon-farring motherfuckers in action. Don't pretend your shit don't stink. You're telling me Vulcans never get heated with each other? They never have the odd bar brawl here and there? They never do weird sex stuff on the holodeck? Fuck off. They could easily run into trouble out in the galaxy just like we could. I take very personally what these pretend aliens have done to humans in the future that hasn't happened. Most importantly, Vulcans also value science, yet they wouldn't allow humans to explore the galaxy until long after we could have. This would be like if the US did incessant grandstanding about democracy, but when global South nations democratically elected socialist heads of state, we assassinated them and installed fascist dictators. Good thing that's never happened. Yeah, you get it. It's not productive to expect a society to be perfect before you allow them to develop. It's the Vulcans thinking they know better than humans in all cases, which then stunted the growth of human society. This is, in my opinion, the danger of the fetishization of logic and reason. There's a strain of guy, this like pseudo-right-wing libertarian type guy, who will claim their positions are based in logic and logic alone, and will instantly dismiss arguments from anyone they deem too emotional, especially women and minorities. But really, these guys are just human beings, so of course they're acting on emotion sometimes, but they think their emotional reactions are just logic, which is really dangerous. What I'm saying is the Vulcan logic shit sometimes reminds me of this guy, and it's just unpleasant. To be fair, though, the Vulcans probably bathe more. Now, also, in fairness, Star Trek writers and directors have made an effort to strike a balance in Vulcans. Like I said earlier, we've seen plenty of Vulcan displays of emotion, and Spock himself uttered the famous line, "Logic is the beginning of wisdom, not the end," in Star Trek VI. Granted, Spock is half human, but to me that just reaffirms Trek's message about the benefits of a multicultural society. Even though they butt heads sometimes, Vulcans and humans have a lot to offer each other. Vulcans are the ones with the motto of infinite diversity in infinite combinations. Keep that in mind when these logic bros and conservatives claim Vulcan ideology and Trek in general as their own. Another important area of Vulcan repression is their incredibly disturbing violent thoughts they apparently hold just below the surface. I believe this concept was first introduced in the Voyager episode Random Thoughts, where the crew visits a planet of telepaths called the Mari. The Mari, being telepaths, have outlawed violent thoughts, which created a society virtually free of violent crime. When Voyager's B'Elanna Torres, who is half Klingon and half human, a lot of halves in Star Trek, has a passing violent thought, it apparently causes a nearby Mari man to assault another Mari, and B'Elanna is arrested.
What does it matter what I was thinking?
Lieutenant B'Elanna Torres, you are under arrest.
On what charge?
Aggravated violent thought, resulting in grave bodily harm.
The Mari insist on the traditional punishment, a procedure to remove the violent thought. Don't think about it too hard. It's just sci-fi. This puts Janeway in a difficult position because Starfleet officers are supposed to respect alien cultures and laws. But Janeway doesn't pull punches.
I don't respond well to threats. This ends right now. Delete the wife.
Tuvok, Voyager's Vulcan officer, does an investigation of his own and discovers that there is a black market for violent thoughts on the Mari planet.
3,000 reds.
I have something exciting for you tonight.
He infiltrates it by trading some of his ancient dark Vulcan thoughts, then presents evidence of the black market to prove violent thoughts are more common than the Mari thought. And B'Elanna is exonerated. So not only are Vulcans repressed and smug, apparently they're fucking narcs. Actually, it's surprising that the episode didn't draw even more of a comparison between the Mari and the Vulcans than it did. Early on, Tuvok develops a close working relationship with Namira, one of the few remaining security officers on the Mari homeworld. They talk explicitly about some of the similarities between their cultures, like both having overcome a violent past to create a remarkably peaceful present. But once Tuvok learns that this is largely a facade and that there's a black market for dark thoughts, I would think he'd reflect on what that means for him and his fellow Vulcans. This is what I meant earlier when I said Vulcans seem unwilling to reconcile their inner demons and violent past. The images from Tuvok's mind that he shows to the Mari guy might come from some kind of Vulcan collective unconscious or from actually learning about their history. But either way, have they dealt with this history? Have they included all Vulcans in their perfect little society? I'm sure there are various ethnic groups within the Vulcan race. Did they all fit neatly into modern Vulcan life? What I'm getting at here is that the Vulcans very likely have a relationship to their history similar to the one Americans have with our own. In the US, we're aware of some of the inhumane and brutally racist events of our past. Not all of them. But as a whole, we don't recognize that our society is literally built upon these sins and the backs of the oppressed. We learn things in school like Lincoln freed the slaves. Neat and simple. But many of us don't learn the complicated truths, like how the 13th Amendment banned slavery, unless you're in prison, in which case the state or private prison can make you work for nothing or well below minimum wage. I myself don't remember that detail being covered, at least not extensively, when I was in school. Or that Reconstruction was never finished, or all the problems that persist for Black Americans since the passing of the Civil Rights Acts. We know from Star Trek V that Vulcans like Spock's half-brother Sybok were banished for seeking forbidden knowledge and trying to pass it on to others. Let's look at it this way. There's a lot of debate among leftist Star Trek fans, and Star Trek fans in general, over whether the Federation is socialist. which I explored in my past video, What's Missing from Star Trek Socialism. You can watch that one for the long answer, but basically, yes, we can certainly look at the Federation and member planets like Earth and Vulcan as societies that are making very good attempts at something like socialism. They mostly avoid the authoritarian tendencies of places like China and the USSR, and they don't cling to capitalist relics the way European social democracies do. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, and they work to better themselves and the rest of humanity. There you go. The thing is, the Federation of Planets is not quite a dictatorship of the proletariat, and it does have its problems. I mean, they still have fucking penal colonies in the 2370s. Socialism is a process, not a checklist. But the thing is, I don't see Vulcans as all that eager to continue that process. They come across as pretty pleased with themselves, and while they value scientific progress, they seem pretty set in their ways socially and culturally. They have arranged marriages, they have fights to the death over mates and shit. It's a little like, I don't know about this. Humans, on the other hand, are portrayed as adventurous, inquisitive, hopeful, and horny throughout Trek.
Dr. McCoy is right in pointing out the enormous danger potential. But I must point out that the possibilities, the potential for knowledge and advancement is equally great. Risk is our business. That's what the Starship is all about.
As humans have always done, we want to keep exploring, see what's next, and what else we can discover, though thankfully in a less cruel manner by the time of Enterprise. And granted, Vulcans had at least a few centuries of a head start on space exploration to humans, so they may kind of see space as old news. But still, there has been little to no intergalactic travel by Vulcans or humans, and even parts of their own galaxy have yet to be explored. Why did Vulcans lose interest in space exploration? Why are there so few Vulcans in Starfleet? And again, socially and culturally, humans still seem to have the edge. The human desire to change society plays out through the roughly 1,000-year timeline depicted in Star Trek. We see the increased acceptance humans have for each other and alien races. We see humans face defining political moments and come out the other end better for it. And simply looking at the captains of the Enterprise over the centuries shows a clear progression towards a more measured approach. Jonathan Archer was necessarily inexperienced, as humans in general were new to deep space travel. While he had plenty of good qualities, he was kind of quick to anger.
You have no idea how much I'm restraining myself from knocking you on your ass.
Made some disturbing and questionable decisions during the cruise journey. A century later, we find Kirk, who was still a bit of a hothead, but benefited from 100 years of development of the Federation, giving him some of the tactical skills to cleverly handle challenges the crew encountered. Then there's Picard, a much more stoic, thoughtful figure. He interestingly became more rebellious in his later career that we saw in the films and now in Star Trek Picard, but he spent most of his time as captain as the ship's moral center, an unwavering leader with a deep respect for everyone on his crew. Even Picard's contemporaries like Benjamin Sisko and Catherine Janeway were more measured than Kirk, seemingly because Starfleet created policies to discourage loose cannons like Kirk.
Captain Sulu, Captain Kirk, Dr. McCoy. They all belonged to a different breed of Starfleet officer. They were a little slower to invoke the Prime Directive, and a little quicker to pull their phasers. Of course, the whole bunch of them would be booted out of Starfleet today.
And now, of course, we have Pike on Strange New Worlds, who predates Kirk by a decade or so. And he's a bit ahead of his time. Pike has some of the gravitas of Picard, while also maintaining a bit of the roguish cowboy nature of Kirk. Now, one last thing I want to touch on here is the mind meld. This is less an issue with the Vulcan society itself, and more about how the phenomenon is presented in the Trek franchise. Now, it's fine to establish in your sci-fi work that some kind of ESP or telepathy is real, and maybe mention some pseudoscience that explains it. That's how all this shit works. But it does get a little silly, in my opinion. For one thing, why do they have to grab your face to do a mind meld? Are they shooting empathy rays through their fingers? Also, why do they have to say a little spell when they do it?
My mind to your mind. Your thoughts to my thoughts.
I'm sorry. Are you a special logic boy or a space wizard? It borders on Jedi shit. And by the way, that's why this is one area where I will certainly defend Star Wars from Trek fans who say Star Wars isn't sci-fi, it's fantasy. First of all, who cares? And yeah, Star Wars does lean towards fantasy, while Trek leans more toward the techno-sci-fi and futurism. But it's not like we're on opposite ends of the spectrum. Like, you may think the spore drive from Discovery is stupid, but let's not pretend Star Trek has always stuck to pure science before.
Her DNA is in a state of ribocytic flux. Her genetic codes are being resequenced. I believe she is amphibian, sir.
Now, before I go, I just want to reiterate that this was not meant to be an attack on Vulcans, and I actually think most Vulcan characters are really cool. Some of my best friends are Vulcan, but I do think that as fans, as intelligent viewers, and as socialists, it's important to deconstruct some of what our faves have to offer. Think of it as futuristic materialism instead of historical materialism. Thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree or have anything else to add. And if you would be so kind, help us out with a like, comment, subscribe, one-time donation, and if you can, hit us up on Patreon. Bye now.